Well, hello, everyone. I'm Guy Winch, and I'm here to speak to you about emotional first aid. And so first of all, thank you for having me back. It's great to be back here at Google. So let's get going. I'm going to assume that within the past few weeks, some of you have had a cut or a scrape, and you've used antibacterial ointment, or you've used a Band-Aid. And some of you might have had a cold and rested up in bed. And some of you might have sprained a muscle and used an ice pack. And I say that because we get these kinds of physical injuries all the time in life. And when we do, we know exactly how to treat them, we know exactly how to ease our aches and pains, and we know exactly what steps to take to prevent them from getting worse. Well, we sustain psychological injuries all the time in life as well. But when we do not know how to treat them, we do not know how to ease our aches and pains, and we do not know what steps we need to take to make sure they don't get worse. And that's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about 7 common psychological injuries that we encounter in daily life: failure, rejection, guilt, loneliness, brooding and rumination, loss and trauma, and bouts of low self-esteem. I do hope we'll have time to get to all of them. We will also talk about the surprising ways in which these things impact us, because they do it in ways which are unexpected. We'll also look at the science, because for scientists to study these things, they have to recreate these human experiences, in essence, in their lab. You can't grow rejection in a petri dish, and so that's a difficult thing to do. We'll look at how they do it, and I'll give you a hint right now. It usually involves lying through their teeth to the poor subjects who sign up for these experiments without a clue about what they're getting themselves into. And lastly, we'll look at why and how we should apply emotional first aid to these kinds of common psychological injuries, and we'll look at a few examples of how we can actually do it. Now, I want to get back for a moment to the comparison between how we think in general of physical injuries versus how we think of psychological injuries, because it's so obvious to us that we need to monitor our physical health. We need to monitor our bodies. That's very, very clear to us. But it's not clear to us at all that we need to monitor our psychological health. And when we are riding our bicycle or our skateboard and we wipe out, the first thing we'd think to do is to check ourselves for injury. But when we have a really bad rejection or a really bad failure, we don't think to check ourselves for any kind of injuries. We just go on. And the other thing is that we know what kind of injuries require treatments when they're physical injuries so they don't get worse. We know that if we don't, that a cut can get infected. We know a cold can turn into a pneumonia, so we know we need to attend to that. We don't know anything about what psychological injuries can get worse or how they can get worse. And lastly, when it comes to the basic physical injuries we sustain in daily life, we can pretty much treat all of them at home. We have our medicine cabinets with our pills and our ointments, and we can pretty much do all of that at home. And when it comes to psychological injuries, as I say, we don't know how to treat diddly, but that means we really have no clue about what we're doing. And it isn't just our physical bodies that we're prioritizing, it's even our teeth, if you really think about it. Because, look, we know our teeth need constant care, right? We know that. We brush and we floss, and we do that every single day. And not only that, if we have a pain in the tooth, we immediately take action. We go to the dentist because we know, that cavity can turn into a root canal, so we know to do it. And we even teach our children to brush their teeth every day. 3-year-olds know to brush their teeth every day. So if you really think about it, we put more care into our teeth than we do our psychological health. And I'm sorry, but it really irritates me that that's the case. And I'm not suggesting you neglect your teeth. That's not my point. And I'm not resentful. I don't hate the American Dental Association. I think teeth are great. I have teeth. I'm all for teeth. What I'm saying is that there is a strange favoritism that we have, whereas our physical health and our teeth are like the stepsisters in the Cinderella story that get all the love and all the care and all the affection, and our poor psychological health is as ignored and as marginalized and as neglected as Cinderella left to sweep the floor with the mice and the birds. Now, that's Freud, you see, because it's very hard to depict psychological health in a picture. So I use, and you can see the cigar, that's the hint. All right. So anyway, so my point is that that fairy tale is not going well. But here's the good news. Happy ending. Here's your fairy godmother, and here's your Prince Charming. I don't mean the picture of me in the flat. But here's your Prince Charming, because what you can do is you can start to help the psychological health catch up a little bit and help take care of it. So look, as I said, psychological injuries impact us, and in more ways than we realize, in surprising ways. So I want to show you how. And I'm going to start with a really common injury, failure. Something we certainly all do. And when I tell people, oh, that's going to surprise you, they're like, no, it's not. I know what happens to me when I fail. I fail, my ego gets bruised, and I get demoralized, and, and my motivation goes, and all of that is true. But failure also impacts us in ways of which we are not aware. And here's an example of a study people did. They took people to a field with a football post, and they had them kick an American football over the post 10 times. And it was 10 yards away. It was an unmarked field, but it was 10 yards away. And then they had them, when they were done, say, right, well, how far and how high is that goalpost? And everyone wrote down how far and how high the goalpost was. But then when they looked at the results, they divided them into people who succeeded and people who failed at the task. And the people who failed at kicking the football over the goalpost estimated it to be much further and much higher than the people who succeeded. Now, they're all standing on the same field. It's not an eyesight issue. They're looking at the same thing. But that's what failure does to us. It can distort our perceptions, our very perceptions of the goals we have, so that they seem to us to be further away and further out of reach. And that is an unconscious thing. That's an unconscious way in which that happens. But failure can also impact us in other ways. It can also change our perceptions of our actual abilities. And I'm going to give you one other example of an experiment. This one was done quite a few years ago. And they were curious about how people respond to failure. But they did the experiment with dogs. Some of you might have heard of it. It's not a new one. They put dogs in a cage with a low barrier in the cage. And one part of the cage was wired up for an electrical shock. And they say it's an uncomfortable electrical shock, not a painful one for the dogs, though whether they interviewed the dogs and asked them if that was uncomfortable or painful, I'm not sure. But still, so they put the dog in that part of the cage, they zap it, the dog jumps over the barrier into the safe part of the cage, part one done. Part two, they put the dog back in the cage, but this time they put a harness on the dog. They tether the dog so the dog can't move, zap the cage, dog tries to jump over the barrier, can't, whimpers, done with part two. Part three, remove the harness, and then they zapped the cage again. And the dogs were free to jump over the barrier. And an alarming number of these dogs didn't jump over the barrier. They just stood there and whimpered because they actually thought we're incapable. Even though they weren't tethered, they were free. And so the scientists were like, wow, we wonder if it works that way with people. But it turns out ethical committees frown upon putting people in cages and electrocuting them. So they did it differently. What they did was they gave people a test, and they said, oh, this test actually measures your intelligence. But what they did is half the people got a test that was passable, and half people got a test that was impossible. They were going to fail. It couldn't pass this test. And then they gave them another version of the test after that. And this version, everyone could pass. And again, an alarming number of the people who were given the impossible test and failed it, failed the one they should and could have passed, because they believed that their abilities weren't up to the task. And it turns out that when you believe your abilities are not up to the task, you can't use them. They're as if that you don't have them. And so what happened was that the failure distorted their perceptions of their basic fundamental abilities. And that's what failure can do to us. It can take one experience, one small experience, and turn it into something much bigger that impacts our lives going forward in ways of which we are unaware. And that's why I consider failures to be emotional chest colds that become psychological pneumonias, or can become psychological pneumonias. And I want you to think about times in your life where you were convinced you couldn't succeed at something, and maybe you need to rethink it, because maybe you were being influenced in ways of which you were not aware. Let's look at another example, brooding and ruminating. So it's natural to reflect on painful experiences when we have them. It's something we all do. Experiences or worries, we tend to do it. If our boss yells at us in a meeting, don't think that happens much at Google, but all right. But let's say, your boss yells at you in a meeting, then, and embarrasses you in front of your colleagues, then you might stew about it, and you might think about it, and then you might talk to this colleague about it, and you talk to that colleague about it, and then you go home and you call your friends and you think about it, and you think about it at night before you go to bed, and you think about it the next day, and you think about it over the weekend, and then you start to, involve fantasy in the thoughts. So the fantasy, you have the heroic fantasy where you envision the boss yelling at you, but then you stand up to the boss and everyone applauds and it's a happy ending, and then you have this the victim fantasy where the boss yells at you again and you just break into tears, and the boss realizes how harsh and unreasonable they are, and they apologize and they hug, and it's all very nice. And then you have the tragic version where you yell back and you end up homeless on the streets, whatever it is, but you replay it over and over and over again. And you might think, so fine, so I'm processing my feelings if that's how I'm feeling. I'm talking about it to friends. I'm expressing my feelings. I'm processing them. Surely, as a psychologist, I should be very pleased when people are processing their feelings. Surely I should be thrilled. Well, no, I'm not thrilled. This is not my thrilled face. And I'm not thrilled because there are differences in self-reflection. There is adaptive self-reflection, and there is maladaptive self-reflection. So let's look at the differences. When you are self-reflecting in a way that is adaptive, what you are doing is you are easing your emotional distress. The whole idea of adaptive self-reflection is that it lowers the potency of the event so that when you think about it afterwards, it evokes less emotion, it's less distressing. And that happens because by thinking it through, you're reaching new insights. You're seeing things from a fresh perspective. You're learning something. You're remembering, for example, that, in that meeting, I actually disagreed with the boss before they yelled at me, and no one really does disagree with that boss. So I stepped on the boss's toes, then the boss has stepped on my toes. I understand what I shouldn't do in the future. Or you talk to other people and hear, yeah, that person has an anger management issue. You can decide, maybe I want to speak to human resources and try and transfer. The idea is it clarifies actions that you can take to fix your situation. So having those insights and having the idea of what you need to do differently, it all adds up to like a certain release that you feel, and it helps you move on, and you can move on, and it's less troubling. But that's when the self-reflection is adaptive. When it's maladaptive, what it does is it just increases our emotional distress. That's what it does. And the thing is that we used to think that, if you're just getting your anger out, if you're just expressing it, it's a release. There's a stereotype of the psychologists. They always say, punch a pillow when you're angry. Have you heard the punch the pillow theory? So there was this movie years ago with Billy Crystal and Robert De Niro called Analyze This. Have you heard of this film? And Billy Crystal plays a therapist, and Robert De Niro is a patient who has anger issues, and he's in the mob. So Billy Crystal says, well, if you're angry, why don't you punch the pillow? And Robert De Niro goes, good idea. And he takes out his gun and he shoots the pillow 3 times. And Billy Crystal is alarmed and he goes, feel better? And Robert De Niro goes, yeah, I do. But Hollywood, because actually that's not what happens. When we do studies with a pillow punching, and we have some people feel annoyed and think of a person and punch a pillow, and other people feel annoyed and think of the person and not punch a pillow, the people who punch the pillow are angrier afterwards, they're more aggressive afterwards, and they're more likely to take out their aggression on innocent people than the people who just thought about it but didn't punch the pillow. So this catharsis theory doesn't work. So just stewing doesn't help us. And in fact, it makes the urge to keep thinking about it more potent. The idea will flash into your head more often and more frequently and more powerfully. And the other thing is that when we're doing so much stewing and so little doing, it actually makes us feel passive, and it makes us start to have problems with problem solving. And here's another slightly shocking example. They did a study in which they looked at women who found a lump in their breast. How long does it take them to call their doctor to make an appointment? And they looked at that and they divided the women into two groups, women who tend to ruminate and women who don't tend to ruminate. And the women who tended to ruminate waited on average 2 months longer to make an appointment with their doctor, which is a critical amount of time when you find a lump in your breast. And that is because they were probably so worried about it and looking it up and discussing it with people and what if this and what if that, but they weren't acting. And so that's what can happen. So when we brood and when we ruminate, we get very, very passive. We see the world in negative terms, so it puts us more at risk for depression. It puts us more at risk for alcoholism because we get angry all the time because we're stirring ourselves up. We have to take the edge off at the end of the day. It puts us at risk for eating disorders because we want to manage our feelings with food. And it also, we're releasing so many stress hormones into our bloodstream, it puts us at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. So that's all of the things that rumination does. And so to me, ruminating and brooding is basically like picking at emotional scabs. You're opening the wound, you're not letting it heal, you're not doing something good. All right, let's look at one other example. And one of the injuries I get asked about a lot is guilt. And not just by my mother. So we all experience guilt quite a bit. But how much guilt do we experience? Well, in short bursts of guilt, you know, like, oh, I have to call her. Oh, it's an hour now, I still haven't called. But short bursts like that, we can have 2.5 hours a day of mild guilt, 5 hours a week of moderate guilt, and 3.5 hours a month of severe guilt. So that's a lot of guilt, except that guilt is not necessarily a bad thing, because it does something really important. It alerts us, it gives us a warning as to when we might have done or might intend to do something that can cause harm to another person. And that allows us to not do the thing, or to apologize if we've done the thing, or to atone for it in some kind of way. So guilt is a great thing because it really preserves our relationships. It's a relationship protector. And so that's a good thing. Except that when your guilt is unresolved, when it's excessive, that little flashing signal in your brain like, oh, call your mother, doesn't shut off. It just keeps going and going. And that can be an extremely distracting thing. It's a huge mental drain. It impairs our ability to focus and to concentrate. But it also does a bunch of things of which we are often unaware. Sometimes aware, but sometimes unaware, because it turns out our unconscious minds make decisions about how it's going to manage guilt without us. Like the committee met without us and then decided, oh, we're going to do this. And so what does our unconscious mind tend to do? Prevents us from enjoying life. In one experiment, college students were made to feel guilty, and the typical scenario with guilt is they play this game in which they tell them, oh, the way you played the game, you deprived your other student, who's fictitious and doesn't exist, but you deprived the other student of lottery tickets. 2 lottery tickets, big whoop, not a big thing to feel guilty about. But then they offer them, now you have payment for the experiment, you can choose. And so people who weren't made to feel guilty chose movie tickets and DVDs and CDs, and the students who were made to feel guilty by, again, depriving someone they didn't know of 2 lottery tickets, what did they choose? Notebooks and pens and folders and fun stuff. So, you know, and so that's what guilt does. It prevents us from enjoying life. But it does more than that. It actually makes us adopt self-punishment. In another version of that experiment, they wanted to see whether students who were made to feel guilty, again with the lottery ticket scenario, whether they would be willing to give themselves an electrical shock, which they claimed, again, was uncomfortable, not painful. And they set them up with this box where they could put their hand in the box and flip the switch if they were willing to do that. And then they pointed to some research assistant sitting there and going, that's the guy that didn't get the lottery ticket. And zap, everyone was zapping themselves. Now, psychologists have a heart, so it actually wasn't rigged to give them a zap. They just wanted to see if they pressed the button. There was no benefit from actually giving them an electrical shock. So that was the test. But so many of them were like, oh yeah, zap, I'll zap myself for lottery tickets, for goodness sakes, for crying, I mean, for someone they didn't know. So it can make us adopt self-punishment. And it actually has a name in psychology. It is called the Dobie effect. Who knows why? Really? Harry Potter, thank you so much. The elf in Harry Potter that smacks his head against the wall because Dobby's a bad elf, that's what it's named after, literally the fictitious elf. So, I don't know. And the other thing that guilt does is that it makes us really try and avoid the people or the situation or any reminders of the things that we did. So, you know, if we did something and Aunt Flossie's very upset with us, we don't want to really meet with Aunt Flossie and with Uncle Harry either because he's related, and we stay away a little bit, and it happened in that part of town, so we're going to stay away from that part of town. And she used to live in Philly, we don't want to go to Philly anymore, and we'll slowly really try and withdraw and avoid, and it can really hamper our relationships. And so what happens, guilt is so toxic to us and so toxic to our relationships, I consider it the poison in our system. Now let's get to the most common psychological injury we all experience, and that is rejection. Rejection are an extremely regular part of life, if you think about it, because, you know, we get turned down by potential dates, we get turned down by potential employers, our partners rebuff our sexual advances, our friends go to lunch without us, our colleagues don't tell us about the birthday party, our neighbors give us the cold shoulder, our parents don't approve of our lifestyles, our social media contacts don't post our posts and they don't retweet our tweets, and all of it. There's just so many ways in which we can get rejected. But all of them have one thing in common, and that is they really, really hurt. And that's the thing that fascinated scientists at the beginning when it came to rejection. Why do they hurt so much? Why does it hurt so much? So they wanted to study it. The thing is, you have to be able to catch rejection in action if you want to study it. You know, you can't just take your research assistant to a local singles bar and go, oh, look, that dude just got shot down. Quick, give him the questionnaire. That's not going to work. So you have to recreate it in some kind of way. So how do you recreate it? So here's what they did. Imagine that you signed up for a psychological experiment, which none of you are ever going to do after this talk. But just imagine you signed up for an experiment, and you're sitting in the waiting room, and there are two other people in the waiting room. And there's a ball on the table, and one of them takes the ball and goes, you know, and throws it to the other person. And the other person catches it and goes, and throws it to you. And you catch it, and you don't have to go, all right, I don't know why I said that. So, and you catch it, and you throw it back to the first person, who then goes, throws it to the second, and the second doesn't throw it to you, throws it back to the first person, who then also doesn't throw it to you, throws it to the second person, and now they are tossing the ball, and you're excluded. And then the researcher shows up and goes, oh, no, we're ready for you now, and takes you into the other room. Now, how would that make you feel? Now, most people think, two strangers in a waiting room didn't toss me a ball. Big whoop. I don't care. But it turns out we care quite a bit, because this is a paradigm that has been used dozens and dozens of times. And everyone who goes through it reports feeling significant emotional pain. And not just emotional pain, it hurts people's moods, it makes them angry, it hurts their self-esteem, and this is about as mild as rejection gets. And so, you know, the experimenters were really, really curious about, wow, so this is a very kind of potent thing. I mean, let's try something. What if, does it depend on who the people are? So they said, let's run the experiment again, and what if we told them that the people who rejected them were people they despise? So they run the experiment again, and they take people into the other room, and they go, you know, those two people in the waiting room are here for some kind of social science experiment. They are members of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK members. Now, does it hurt? And people were like, yeah, it still hurts. And scientists were like, wow, that's amazing. So let's try something even more radical. So they ran it again. They took them in and they go, okay, we're coming clean. Those were research assistants. It wasn't real. The whole thing was rigged. Now does it hurt? And people were like, yeah, it still hurts. So scientists were like, what is going on in our brain here with this rejection thing? Like, how come it's so unreasonable? I mean, we're telling people it wasn't real and they're still hurting. So they put people in a functional MRI machine. They wanted to see literally what happens in the brain. And what they found was shocking to them, because what they saw was that the same pathways in the brain light up when we get rejected as light up when we experience physical pain. They were literally overlapping. The rejection pathways were piggybacking on physical pain pathways in the brain. And so that was really shocking to them. And then the scientists were like, well, maybe we don't have to do many experiments. Maybe we'll just give people Tylenol, you know. And so they did. They ran the experiment again and gave half the group of people Tylenol, and the people who got Tylenol reported less emotional pain. Because again, these are physical pain pathways that are getting activated. So acetaminophen, a pain reliever, was enough to... Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out on your next date packing Tylenol, because A, it's a little pessimistic, if you ask me, and I'm not sure that's the best thing. But they were really curious about, so why is that? Why are we wired to experience rejection so severely? Why? And the answer is because of our evolutionary past, because we grew up in tribes, we evolved in tribes, and we couldn't survive outside them. As hunter-gatherers, we needed our tribe. Being ostracized from your tribe was a death sentence. So we evolved an early warning mechanism. We evolved a way to alert us when we were at risk of being ostracized from our tribe. And that was rejection. So people who experience rejection as more painful were more likely to take corrective action, were more likely to stay in the tribe, were more likely to pass along their genes. And people who didn't were more likely to be ousted from the tribe, and they didn't live to pass along their genes. That's why that mechanism evolved. But it also explains why we feel things so harshly. And today, we don't live in small pockets of humanity. We live in rather large pockets of humanity. So the opportunities for rejection are innumerable. And that's why I consider rejection to be the cuts and scrapes of daily life. Now, I hope you're beginning to realize that these simple psychological injuries are not so simple, that they really do impact us in very significant ways, that they can damage our emotions and our mood and our perceptions and our thinking and our cognition and our behavior and our mental health and our emotional well-being and even our physical health, because I gave you the example of brooding and ruminating. But let me give you one other example, because there's one more psychological injury that's even more damaging to our physical health than brooding, and that one is loneliness. 40% of adults will experience loneliness in their lifetime. We can experience that when we move away to college, when we move to a new town, a new state, or a new country, when we get divorced, when our children grow up and leave the nest, when we retire and we stop seeing our colleagues. Loneliness is something we can all experience, and it damages us psychologically. But physically, what it does to us is quite alarming, because, yes, like rumination, it does put us at risk for cardiovascular disease and for depression. But it also puts us at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and it also suppresses our immune systems. They did one study in which they gave college freshmen the flu shot, and they just gave them questionnaires about loneliness. And the students who were lonely, who reported feeling really lonely, had a poorer response to a flu shot than the students who didn't. It really impacts our immune system. And so scientists have concluded that the risk factors posed by loneliness are actually equal to the health risk factors posed by cigarette smoking, because it can shave chronic loneliness, yes, can shave years off our lives. Now, cigarette packs come with warnings from the Surgeon General. This is a dangerous, dangerous thing. But we don't have warnings about loneliness. We don't know if we're inhaling 2 packs of loneliness a day that it's going to kill us at the end of the story. And that is an important thing. The other thing that loneliness does is that it really, it makes us isolated. It keeps us to ourselves. So our whole relationship skills and our social skills and our ability to relate and to get into deep relationships, they atrophy over time and they get weaker. And that's why I consider loneliness to be some form of relationship muscle weakness. We're not used to using those muscles. And a lot of time when somebody's been, let's say, single, and then they start dating again, they come out and either they're way too intense or they're way too suspicious because their muscles are not quite regulated well. Unfortunately, they don't conclude, I need to work on this. They conclude, you see, I'm unlovable, so let me just retreat again. So loneliness is very self-reinforcing, and we really, really need to find ways to treat it. So, as I said, our physical health is certainly very much impacted by these psychological injuries as well. So now I hope you can see why I was so upset earlier, about why I'm so upset that these things get ignored, that we ignore these psychological injuries, because look at what they do to us. They have such a huge impact on our lives. So now let's look at what we can do about them. And so since we were talking about rejection, let's start with that. I mean, we have time for a couple of examples, but let's start with rejection. Now, remember I said that when it comes to psychological injuries, we sometimes don't even realize we're injured. Not the case with rejection. We know that pretty much very, very well, because we have a strong response to rejection. So let's look at how people typically respond to rejection. So one of the first things that happens is people can get slightly angry or aggressive. Fatal Attraction, anyone? I don't know, you know the movie? So she boiled a bunny and then she came at him with a knife. So you can get slightly aggressive when you feel rejected. The other thing people typically do, when I ask people, so what do you do when you feel rejected? Vodka. I mean, they reach for the bottle, or tequila, whatever. They reach for the bottle. Not a good idea. Turns out that when you stuff your feelings down with alcohol, they often come back up again. So that's not going to work. And the other thing we often do is we turn to food. We try and drown our sorrows with food by, hogging the dessert bowl, perhaps while somebody has a sympathetic hand on your shoulder while you're doing it. Now, needless to say, these responses don't really work very well. They don't really do anything for the rejection. They just numb you out or give you a sugar high or whatever it is. So what do we need to do? How do we need to really treat rejection? There are several wounds we need to treat, but the most urgent of them is that we need to do something to revive our self-worth, because our self-esteem just took a body blow. So we need to do something to revive our self-worth. And one of the ways that is most common in terms of how people do that is positive affirmations. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Those are statements like, I am attractive and worthy. I'm going to be a great success. You will find those statements in books and on refrigerator magnets and at the bottom of annoying emails, and you'll see them everywhere. And the thing about positive affirmations, you'll think, well, that's great, that's a nice thing, I'll recite that mantra on a regular basis. But when we do studies about them, what we find is that positive affirmations don't work. And worse, people whose self-esteem is feeling low actually end up feeling worse when they use positive affirmations, not better, actually worse. Well, why is that? Why is it that when your self-esteem is low, telling yourself that you're going to be successful and people are going to love you and everything is going to be great, why would that make you feel bad? Well, we have to look at persuasion theory. Persuasion theory tells us that when a statement falls within the boundaries of our belief system, we'll accept it. And when a statement falls outside the boundaries of our belief system, we'll reject it. And so when you're feeling really unworthy of love and really unworthy of success, and you're telling yourself, I'm worthy of love, I'm worthy of success, you'll actually reject that statement. Your unconscious mind will reject that statement, and you'll actually endorse the other statement of, no, actually, I don't feel like I'm worthy of love. I don't feel like I'm going to have success. It's going to make you feel worse. And I'll tell you, the positive affirmation industry, I mean, there's subliminal tapes. It's an amazing thing. But the people who need it most are the ones most likely to be harmed by it. So that's unfortunate. So what should you do? Well, there is another kind of affirmation that actually does work, and that's the one I'm going to suggest. It's called self-affirmations. And the thing about self-affirmations is they are generated by you. So you know they fall within the boundary of your belief system because you're the one that has to come up with them. And here's one of the exercises I suggest in the book to revive your self-esteem. I say, and I'm saying it now, make a list of 5 qualities, attributes that you have that you really believe are valuable in whatever the domain is. So let's say it was a romantic rejection. You can write that, I'm loyal, I'm emotionally available, I'm very supportive, I'm really open to all kinds of fun, I'm a great cook, whatever. You make a list of attributes. If it's in the employment domain, then I have a great work ethic, a high learning curve, I'm reliable, I'm responsible, I'm motivated. You make your list, as long a list as you can possibly generate, and then you write a brief essay, 1 or 2 paragraphs about one of the items on your list in which you talk about why that's important, why you value it, why other people value it, how you've expressed it in the past, how that impacted people, how you might express it in the future. You really elaborate why that's an important thing. And that will actually remind you of self-worth that you actually have. It'll remind you of, you know what? I am pretty much a good bargain for those people to hire me, or actually I do have a lot to offer in the dating realm. That will make you feel better doing that. Now, some people say to me, I've tried it, it didn't work. And I'm like, you've made the list and you wrote the essay? No. I just thought about those things, and I thought about why they were important. And I'm like, well, you know, that's like saying I was hungry, so I thought about the food I had in my fridge. Turns out I'm still hungry. You know, no, you have to write the essay. You have to make the list, because making the list is like taking the food out of the fridge and cooking it, and writing the essay is how you eat it. It's how you absorb it. Your brain needs for you to think about it, to process it, to write it. That's how the message gets absorbed, not on spec in some 30-second rushed thing. That doesn't work. So you actually have to write. The essay is an important thing. Now, it turns out that trying to boost our self-esteem is a good idea in general. And this is something I talk about in the self-esteem chapter of the book. Because when our self-esteem is higher, not too high, but higher, it can actually function as a buffer when we encounter things like rejection and failure and anxiety and stress. Now, I'm saying higher, not high, because narcissists, for example, who seemingly have very high self-esteem, it doesn't act as a buffer. You one small insult to a narcissist and they're a puddle on the floor of outrage. So it's about higher, but not too high. And so we know that when your self-esteem is higher, it can actually help you feel more emotionally resilient. And self-esteem is like this armor that you can wear to life that will help protect you. And that's why I consider, and when your self-esteem is low, it's like having an emotional immune system. And when your emotional immune system is low, you're more vulnerable. And when it's high, you're less vulnerable. So low self-esteem is like having a weak emotional immune system. And using self-affirmations will boost it. But there is one other thing that will boost it that I want to mention as well. And this is why I think it's so important that we're aware of our self-esteem as a psychological construct that we actually have to protect. Because it's like this armor. And what happens that when our self-esteem is low, the most damage it sustains is by us. When our self-esteem is low, we tend to be self-critical and self-blaming and look at all our faults and focus on everything we do wrong, and we are like kicking ourselves when we're down. Now, it's something we all do very, very naturally. You know, we'll call ourselves loser and stupid. People do it all the time. They do it publicly. I'm such a loser. Like, shut up. That's not a good thing to do. Because if you thought of self-esteem as literally an emotional immune system, or like armor that you were going to wear to the battle of life, you would hardly see people preparing to wear their armor by poking holes in it and making it weaker. That would not be something you would do. You would think to strengthen it. That's what our self-esteem is. It needs to be strengthened. And so one of the ways to do that, one other technique you can use to do that, is the following. When you feel yourself, when your self-esteem is low, and you feel yourself being very critical, and you're feeling bad about yourself, and again, I should say, you know, our self-esteem, it fluctuates day to day, hour to hour. It's not this monolithic thing, I have good self-esteem or I have bad self-esteem. It can be good 1 minute and bad the next. It's like having a bad hair day or a good hair day. You can have a good self-esteem day or a bad self-esteem day. So it can really fluctuate. We can all have moments of low self-esteem. When your self-esteem is low, when you're feeling yourself becoming self-critical and self-blaming, do the following. Again, it's a writing thing, because remember, that's how we absorb best. Write out, if you had a dear, dear friend who was saying to you, this is how I feel self-critical, I feel bad about myself, I'm blaming myself for this, I think I have all these faults, what would you write to them if you were trying to cheer them up, if you were trying to encourage, if you were trying to nurture? What would you say if you were trying to soothe them and remind them of all the great things that they are? Write that out, and that is what you need to say to yourself in those moments. Another writing exercise, it's called adopting self-compassion. And self-compassion is a great antidote to low self-esteem, because it reminds you to treat yourself kindly, to allow your self-esteem to recover, to allow your emotional immune system to get stronger again. And if you do, it actually will. And so those two exercises, one is for rejection, the other for self-esteem, but you can use them both for self-esteem, are two things you can do because they happen very, very frequently. And I assure you that if you practice them, if you take the time to do the thinking and do the writing, you will feel better. So look, I want to talk about the benefits then of practicing emotional first aid, what it can do for you. It can ease your emotional pain. It can restore your cognitive functioning. It can help you think more clearly. It can minimize risks of infection, like we saw with failure, and damage to your long-term mental health. It can minimize risks to your physical health, and it can increase your emotional resilience over time. These self-esteem exercises, for example, will increase your emotional resilience if you do them regularly. So look, I hope I've been able to convince you to invite Cinderella to the ball, to really think of your psychological health as something that needs as much attention and as much care as, yes, you give your teeth. And I've looked at you all have good teeth. So do that to your psychological health. I really hope that the next time you experience some kind of psychological injury, you won't just hurt, but you'll try applying emotional first aid. Thank you very much. So we do have time for some questions if there are any brave souls who want to ask any.
I'll be a brave soul.
Excellent.
I wonder where you think the practices of Buddhism, like mindfulness, and even I was thinking of the meditation, loving kindness, fall in terms of first aid for our emotional well-being? Okay, it's a great question. And I'm actually all for them because I do think they are good examples. I mean, they're actually what I'm saying. The mindfulness, and especially the Buddhist mindfulness, is a way of thinking about your life in a way that does practice this. It's a way of thinking about things in a way that you're paying attention to your psychological state, to your thoughts, to your feelings, and especially a lot of those things, they really do that trick of being kind to yourself. Mindfulness is a way in which, for example, mindfulness meditation is a way in which you reflect on your thoughts and your feelings, but you don't judge them. You might note, I'm feeling this, then you move it away and you try and keep concentrating, and you do that over time to kind of clear your mind and move the thoughts away, just label them so you know what they are, but not, no emotional judgments to them. And they are actually very therapeutic. And there are a couple of exercises in the book which are very mindfulness in their approach. So yes, I think that is actually a good thing. I think it falls within the spectrum of the things I'm talking about. Cool, thanks.
Hi. So I wanted to think, when you're planning something where you're going out for like a job interview or you are going on a date, one thing I'll do that I don't think it works, and I don't know if it's true or not, is to try and pump myself up beforehand. So like getting myself like, oh, you can do this, you got this, when I maybe feel like I don't. Do you think that's something that can make the rejection or the damage worse?
So here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that I think the pumping up is a good idea. How I would do it is more specifically. I've got this, or yay for me, is too general. I would actually maybe do that self-affirmation exercise. I would maybe sit and journal a little bit about all the things you have to offer to this prospective date, all the things that you have to offer to this prospective employer, because that will actually get you in touch with real stuff that will allow you to be more confident and be more yourself. Because when we're nervous, we're too much thinking about what are they thinking of me? And you're not enough thinking about, well, what do I think of them? And, do they want me to work here? Well, do I want to work there? And do they like me? Well, do I like them? So doing that, do the self-affirmation exercise, I think will put you in touch with more real things, give you true confidence, as opposed to the general kind of, yeah, which kind of is like, it's like a balloon. It's not very substantive inside. So I would use the self-affirmation exercise before a date or a job interview.
Thanks.
Anyone else? No? All right. Well, look, thank you very, very much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me again. Have a great day.